if the old adage is we're all captains, we're all crew, then you fulfilled that bill because you're the only operator, right?
Yeah, I was the only captain, and for much of the time the only crew. That's tough being a single hander on the graveyard shift. There's a lot going on there where you're trying to be awake and trying to sleep at the same time.
The dog watch.
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is the monthly show of the Zero Waste Advocacy Committee, where we feature something that's interesting going on in the zero waste world, and we combine that with an inspiring story or two of pioneering recyclers. So tonight we kind of combine those. We're thrilled to have with us to talk about his work is Captain Charles Moore, who was a true anti-plastic warrior and one of the first people really to call attention to all the gobs of plastic that's out there in the ocean. So we're going to talk about his making people aware of that and what he sees after 20 years, what he sees the future looking like. Before we get there, we're going to have our monthly segment from the Recycling Archives, where we usually feature individuals who did something great and good in recycling. But since we've got a lot of data and a lot of responses to similar questions from these folk, tonight we're going to have a curated compilation of folks talking about what inspired them to go into recycling and zero waste. As Charles Moore will hear, inspired a lot of people to care about plastic in the ocean. So I want to turn first to Susan Kinsella, who is the director of the Recycling Archives and a wonderful reader who's going to share some stories about inspiration amongst our recycling community. Susan?
Thank you. Well, the dozens of interviews that we've done so far of pioneers in the recycling field are filled with a whole lot of fascinating stories. And some of them are dramatic, some of them are funny, lots of them show immense creativity, courage, and innovation. But one of the things I most appreciate about working in the recycling field myself for the past nearly 40 years is that it's been very welcoming to people with strong and individualist personalities. They might not have thrived in a corporate suite, but welcomed into the recycling field where they often had free rein to invent the kind of work they loved. They have been great innovators and leaders, developing the founding businesses, researching the issues, leading breakthroughs, and creating advances into new aspects of the field. Part of what we're doing in the Recycling Archives is gathering the stories from these people because we think that they have a lot of lessons for us for the future as well. And one of the first questions we usually ask in an interview is, when were you first aware of recycling? And it's fascinating that the answers often preview the kind of recycling work that each person eventually went into. So here's some examples. When I asked Amy Perlmutter, when were you first aware of recycling? She thought about it and then explained, when I was in college, I took an anthropology class on systems theory. The main reading for that class was Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind. That book changed my life. It made me realize that I was beating myself up unnecessarily for being interested in so many things. I mean, it seemed that I was going from thing to thing to thing, and everything I encountered was great and new, but I thought there was something wrong with me. I was so undirected, so scattered. And what I got out of the systems thinking class was not that I'm not interested in anything, it's that I'm interested in everything. That was like a revelation to me. Everything is connected to everything. And from then on, the question changed from, why am I so scattered, to what are the connectors that excite me? Exploring the connectors is where I should be concentrating my energy. Well, this led Amy to do an independent research project in which she calculated the costs that Chapel Hill and Orange County, North Carolina, were paying to landfill their trash. Then she calculated the market value of the materials that had recycling markets, and she found that the town was paying $30,000 a year to bury materials valued at $500,000. $500,000. This was in 1979, probably one of the first studies to show the treasure of the materials that are being buried in landfills and treated as if they're garbage. So Amy's process of examining why she went from one interest to another led her to do a groundbreaking study. And mind you, she was a college student at the time who was not even being paid. And that eventually led to her becoming the director of solid waste for Passaic County, New Jersey. And after that, the recycling director who built up what had been a fledgling program in San Francisco. Now, when I asked Will Box, when were you first aware of recycling? He answered, I'm from the Netherlands originally. We had a grocery store out there in the country, and recycling was part of how we ran the store. This was in the 1950s, 1960s. We had a big attic where all our cardboard went, and when that attic was full, a truck came by and picked up all the cardboard for recycling. As children, we would go out on Saturdays and do the rounds in town to make some extra money. We would pick up newspapers because we could recycle them at school and then get paid for how many loads of newspapers we'd bring in. So recycling was kind of a natural thing that we did as kids, but we never thought of newspapers as recycling, just as stuff that needs to come back. We did it automatically. We had a lot of farms out there where I grew up, and every farm had a compost pile. That was just natural. Everybody composted. I was different from the rest of my family because I loved the smell of decomposition out in the farmland. My mom used to gag on the smells, but to me, it was like delicious stuff, you know? The rural people never thought anything of it. I mean, smells were just part of life, right? So many years later, Will co-founded a composting business in Sonoma County that made individual compost products that were specific for different soils and different needs of different businesses. And Will says, to me, it was, oh yes, now I'm in the recycling business, but it still didn't feel like recycling. It was rescuing resources to feed the soil. That was the foundation of what I set up the business to do. I think that the things I come up with, the products that I produce, are happening because they talk to me. It's like the material wants to go in that direction, and I listen. I follow what intuitively I feel is correct. When I say, I think spirituality is part of why I create products that work, what I mean is that I live it when I make compost. I don't let it go until I feel like it has life in it. It feels like life in my hands, and that's the test, right? You have to be connected. I think as a society, we have lost that connectivity, and that's really where environmentalism comes down to earth. It feels like we need to get reconnected. Now, when Jay Wexler answered the question, when were you first aware of recycling? He said, we used coal to heat the house where I lived as a boy on Stevens Street in Philadelphia. There were 10 or 12 steps going down to the curb from our house. And our furnace burned coal, which produced ash. The ash was scooped out of the bottom of the furnace and put into barrels. On trash day, we would take the barrels down to the curb for the trashmen to collect. When I was 4 years old, mind you, I started helping. I would peruse that area and I saw that there were black pieces of coal that had missed combustion. So I collected those in a bucket and I took them back inside. Then they were reused because we put them back into the furnace. To help the World War II war effort, our elementary school organized scrap metal collections. We would empty tin cans and then cut the ends. And next we'd flatten the can with the ends inside. Then we would dump them into the scrap metal bin. When I'd go over to the school with our metals and drop them off, I found pretty good stuff that I could use, like Capt guns. That's where I got my first flavor of salvage. Well, Jay ended up being an extremely talented metals salvager who was able to craft all kinds of deals to buy and sell scrap metals and find businesses that needed even the oddest sorts of things. Now, Tanya Levy, answering the question, when were you first aware of recycling, explained, I was born in the USA in 1946. As a young girl, I lived in the center city of Philadelphia, which was part old ethnic fish markets, plus a variety of other stores and small unimproved houses. There was a junk man who would come around and get our bottles and metals and cardboard There was a milkman who would pick up empty bottles of milk and leave full bottles of milk. We kept our discarded food separate for the pig farmer. I guess I was before the curve, but it was just natural. It was the thing to do in my family. But you know, I think there was a time in the late 60s, around 1968, where Ecology Action and others in Berkeley had gotten drop-off recycling going. That was when I first got involved in what soon blew up into the worldwide recycling movement by taking things to that Berkeley drop-off site. Then I just started thinking of it as, of course, this is something we should do as a society. Well, from there, Tanya went on to write a groundbreaking report on the environmental and health threats of burning garbage for energy. Published in 1978, it became the handbook for defeating incinerators all over the United States. To the question, what are we supposed to do with all the garbage if we don't burn it? Her answer was recycle. As Tanya put it, I saw that the recycling vision was not limited just to getting things out of the landfill or picking up litter. Its real identity flashed in front of me with all its pieces in order. I thought, recycling's many applications provide multiple pressure points to change the way that industry looks at resources. We were looking to change the way that industry uses resources to manufacture things. I asked Delynn Keyes, when were you first aware of recycling? And she said, way back then, when she was growing up in the 1950s, you couldn't go to school to learn environmental science or anything close to it. But I always personally recycled. My family recycled because we didn't like to waste things. But then I graduated in sociology from Portland State University in Oregon. So in 1978, right after graduation, Delynn was hired by a new research consulting business that needed someone for their first big project who had the kinds of research and analysis skills that she'd learned in sociology. That project was, as Delynn described it, to organize an industrial waste exchange, working with manufacturers to match up a company that was getting rid of a recyclable commodity with a business or manufacturer that could use it. We did that by creating what we called the database. At one point, that was me sitting on the floor sorting index cards, trying to find matchups in our little office. We didn't have computers then. We only had typewriters. So eventually, Delynn was asked to write the first recycling legislation for the state of Oregon, setting up the architecture for local governments to create their own recycling collection programs. It's still mind-boggling to me that she actually got all the different stakeholders to agree and then got it passed through the state legislature unanimously twice. Neil Seldman's answer to when were you first aware of recycling is quite unusual. He said, I worked in my aunt's cosmetics factory starting at age 6. The factory had both a wholesale and a retail business that it supplied with its products. The manufacturing process itself was fascinating, but I felt assaulted by all the materials being wasted on a daily basis. My first real factory job as a boy was a mixture of reuse and recycling. We children were taught to focus initially on recovering materials from damaged products that our family-owned company was making. As I grew older, I started recycling other materials that were being discarded from the manufacturing process, starting with carbon paper, metal, and glass. Working in a factory as a boy of 6 sounds gruesome, but it was the opposite. In 1951, when I started, my aunt's factory was hardly automated at all. Nearly everything was done by hand. My 8-year-old brother Marty and my 7-year-old cousin Susie worked with me. We were assigned the task of dismantling distressed merchandise, which were finished products that had a flaw and could not be sent to the customers. So Neil grew up working in that factory, and his aunt expected him to take it over eventually, but he went in a different direction and applied his business training to recycling. After college and a PhD, he co-founded the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and is still training local communities to develop their own entrepreneurial recycling and composting businesses and programs in order to create local jobs and financial strength. And my last example here, when Penny Hansen was asked the question, When were you first aware of recycling? She answered, I went out to visit my sister in California in 1969. She just had a baby. We went over to Berkeley to just look around, and I saw the recycling center there. I was very, very intrigued by the activity. Like a lot of other people, I was thinking a lot about the environment those days. This recycling center in Berkeley looked like a really interesting way to get people involved in environmental improvement. I came back from Berkeley to Baltimore, where I was living at that point, and I was going to school at Johns Hopkins University. This was probably about 6 months before the first Earth Day in 1970. I talked with my friends about what I'd seen out in California. I told them that I thought setting up a recycling center was really exciting and something we could focus activity and action around. They thought it was a great idea. Gradually, over the next few months, we began our recycling service. It was relatively easy to start. We didn't know what we were getting into, so we had the optimism of not knowing. For the first 2 years, I became the recycling coordinator for all of our recycling efforts. For 2 years, I climbed into and out of dumpsters. I broke up glass with a nice tire iron. And then one night I was giving a speech to a group of people about recycling and why it was important. A gentleman came up to me afterward and said, we're putting together the Environmental Protection Agency. It's just now been founded. Would you be interested in employment with that agency? I said, well, doing what? And he said, well, we don't have anyone working on recycling. And I said, that sounds like a good idea to me. And that's how Penny Hansen became the first recycling coordinator at the newly formed US Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, DC.
Must be fun to kind of comb through and curate all those.
Yeah, as I'm working on it, I just discover parts of people's interviews I didn't remember and then put it together with ideas about how did this turn out. And it is really interesting and fun.
Well, and it very much resonates because I would imagine everybody on this Zoom at one point or another has become aware of recycling and inspired by it and has been called so that they're here tonight. Otherwise, they wouldn't be. And so these stories must resonate. They must be familiar. And that's part of the Recycling Archive's purpose, is to record them and share them. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for letting it be possible.
Well, thank NICRA for letting it be possible.
Yes.
So segueing into to our featured interview tonight with Captain Charles Moore, talking about awareness. Charles, I want to ask you about something that I know you've talked about many times before, but it sort of sets the stage for the rest of it, and it's about awareness. In the late 1990s, you were sailing from Hawaii. You had thought your destination was back home in Southern California. So you're kind of like Christopher Columbus. You're out in the water. You think you're going to East Asia, and like him, he hit the Bahamas instead. You hit something else, and you became aware of something amazing. Can you describe what it was you saw and what it prompted you to want to do?
There's a great misconception about the ocean, principally because people can't imagine how big it is. And it's as big as all the land mass of the Earth put together, just the Pacific Ocean. So you have to understand that you don't come upon floating things in the ocean as if they were islands. This situation that I observed in 1997, coming back from Honolulu to Long Beach, California, it wasn't an aha moment. It wasn't, eureka, I have found the garbage patch. This is a totally inappropriate vision or imagination that has been foisted onto the world consciousness by media and people of the scientific community that came up with the idea of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Dr. Ebbesmeyer, you know, which is a useful term. It's become a useful term. But in sailing, in terms of, you know, the kind of sniffing out a problem that scientists do is not necessarily always an aha discovery. It's just an inkling that something might be amiss. And so sailing back in 1997, you would normally, as a sailor, go to 40 degrees north, pick up the westerlies and sail back towards San Francisco. But I entered the race not to race. I entered the race to test a mast. I'd been dismasted off American Samoa, and a completely new rig with different shrouds and stays, chain plates. And I wanted to test that, so because it was extremely traumatic to have our mast crack off American Samoa and nearly hit my co-captain. So I wanted to make sure that this mast was strong, and to subject it to forces that might compromise it. I chose to enter the Transpac because if I did push the vessel and it did have problems, I would be surrounded by other vessels that could render assistance. So this coming back from this race is not a straight line. The race over is you avoid the garbage patch because you want wind and the garbage patch is calm. So you sail straight from Long Beach to Honolulu. But on the way back, you typically go up to 40 north and catch the westerlies. Well, we were a research vessel. We had twin diesel engines. You can't use any fuel on the way over because that would disqualify you from the race. So we sailed completely diesel free over to Honolulu. But in coming back, you know, we encountered the largest El Nino on record up to that time, 1997. And it stretched for 1,000 miles of calm right across the latitude I wanted to go to, 35 degrees north latitude, my home port. And so this enormous high pressure cell halfway between Honolulu and California persisted. You couldn't sail through it. You know, I tried going on, I could only go on one engine to try to conserve fuel, but we couldn't sail through it. It's the horse latitudes. It's why sailors in the age of sail had to throw their horses overboard or consume them because they ran out of water for them. They ran out of food because why? Because they had planned a certain number of days to sail from point A to point B, but they ran into a period of calm in these latitudes, these high pressure areas, the North Pacific subtropical high, that they became trapped. It couldn't get away. It couldn't sail away. You're not going to row your boat 1,000 miles. So especially a big cargo ship full of animals and cargo. So these horse latitudes were at their maximum in 1997. And sailing through them meant that I was experiencing an ocean that was predominantly flat and calm, almost like a lake. And in that situation, even in 1997, there had been so much vagrant plastic in the ocean that it allowed enough of it to float to the surface because, you know, chalk totally makes you blind in the ocean. You can't see the trash in the ocean. That's why satellites don't pick up the garbage patch, because as soon as you get reflectivity off the surface of the ocean, that's what you see. It's like radar for satellites. It just that's what they figure. That's what they see. So you can't see down into it and see the trash. So anyway, coming back, I was sensitive to trash in the ocean. I actually, when we first launched the vessel in Eastern Australia, we did the Coast Care research voyage, and we had a whole table of things that we might cite. And when we reached port, we checked on the recycling facilities available at the port. So I had seen, and also had to clean up my local wetlands with 40 bags of trash. So there was an inkling that trash was a problem. But here I was, you know, in the middle of the ocean. The farthest point that you can get from any land is halfway between San Francisco and Hawaii. It's close to 1,500 miles before you can get to any point of land. And that area, when it was calm like that, and all this ability to observe, it would take me up to 5 minutes to see something floating by. But I finally decided, look, I am seeing stuff after a certain amount of time. Something is here. So I don't understand this because I'm as far away from human civilization as I can get. And then I'm seeing obvious anthropogenic debris floating by. I said, I'm going to make myself a bet. I'm going to come on deck. I'm going to observe for 5 minutes, and I'm going to make a bet that I don't see any trash. And so 5 minutes, it going 4 or 5, 6 knots, you're going quite a distance. And it would be logical not to see something, but I always lost the bet. I would always see something within that time frame, and it was not an island of trash. I'm crossing 1,000 miles of ocean looking at this on a regular basis, and I'm waiting and waiting, and then finally seeing something. So it's not an island. It was spread out over an enormous area, and it was just a piece here and a piece there. And I just did a back of the envelope calculation. I said, if there's a half a pound for 100 square meters, and I multiply by the size of this calm area that I'm going through, the circumference of it, and then multiply how much that would amount to, it came out to be approximately the annual deposition in Puente Hills landfill. And that's a very big number, as you all know. So that's what got me to thinking, well, I'm only going to I see these little pieces, but is it really as big as the whole North Pacific subtropical high? Am I to believe that this plastic is distributed throughout the entire El Nino high area that was, hovering between Hawaii and San Francisco? So I've got to come back and check and see if other areas have it. So I went to the scientists at the SQUIRP, the Southern California Coastal Water Research Facility, and talked to their statistician and said, how am I going to? Because I've been doing this monitoring of the marine environment in coastal areas. And in coastal areas, where you are. You can calculate how far you are from the coast and your depth and, a lot of parameters, and you can do a repeatable set of experiments on that geographic area. But in the ocean, in the middle, there's no land, there's no fixed point of reference, and the ocean's moving. That water is in constant motion. So you're never going to get the same piece of water. You're never going to get the same piece of geography. And how are we going to measure this? So Molly Leacaster said, here's what we can do. We can draw a circle, the diameter that you want to study, and we'll go to the center, that radius, east-west, and then we'll turn the vessel and go north-south. And that way you'll get a good representation of what a circle of water, the size that you want to investigate, what kind of a load of debris it might have. So we went ahead and did that research 2 years later in 1999, and then published the paper a year or so later. And the trawl was a 1/3 of a millimeter mesh net, Newston trawl, usually used to look at ichthyoplankton to try to understand how salmon are so cool. This trawl was looking at the plastic, and we did a ratio of the zooplankton collected in this 1/3 of a millimeter mesh net to the plastic collected in here, and the zooplankton lost, it was 6 kilos of plastic for every kilo of zooplankton in this trawl in this middle of this North Pacific subtropical high, even though we went hundreds of kilometers to try to find a place that didn't have this stuff.
Can I interrupt a second?
Off the alarm bells and got the plastic conversation going. Our idea was to pull back the plastic curtain of ignorance that fails to have an understanding of the most common material in the modern era that defines our age.
Charles, that's kind of what I wanted to get to talk to you about it. So it sounds like, to your surprise, in this sort of normally empty area of the ocean, you found a lot of human created debris that was a long way from shore. It was probably surprising to you. You've done a lot to write about it and study it and research it and speak about it. And we're 25 years later. So have we moved the needle at all in terms of preventing or reducing?
Okay, well, all right, you asked for it, so I know about how to answer this. So here we go. Okay. I know you guys are recyclers, but you got to admit one thing. The percentage of the plastics that get recycled from any one material or any one industry is always less than 100%. It's always considerably less than 100% in many cases, all right? So the difficulty in being able to create 100% like nature does pretty much with her recycling, the difficulty there is in the inability to organize the circular economy, the inability to create the routine of recycling. So it becomes so difficult, it becomes so hard as the proliferation of different materials facilitated by plastic. Don't forget the definition of plastic. We looked it up in the 1928 Unabridged Dictionary, said nothing about synthetic polymers. It was only about molding and making things. The ability of plastic, why it is plastic, is because it can make anything really cheap, really good, really exciting, okay? And yet that ability to make everything with plastic and not be able to recycle 100% of it means that there's this vagrant plastic monster. And do you want to take a break before I launch into my next diatribe?
No, I don't need diatribes. So I think that we all get what you're saying, that in a circular economy, you've got to recover stuff. And we don't recover 100% of almost anything. And plastic is probably one of the worst offenders. So we grant all that. But if you're environmentally conscious today, you think there's a goddamn lot of plastic out there. And that's not a good thing. It's breaking down. None of that can be good. And so if you Google things, if you go to YouTube, you find a lot of folks, they're creating vessels to scoop up stuff in the bays and oceans. You've got the trash wheel in Baltimore. You've got all these European countries with their fancy boats. Is that just a waste of time?
It is symbolic of the challenges that you all face. And that is that as you collect vagrant plastics, you collect an insurmountable economic burden in sorting it out. That's why pyrolysis is on the menu. It's that insurmountable economic burden in sorting and recycling, and in the first place, designing for recycling. You know, that's our mantra, is pre-cycle. So, yeah.
What do you think about pyrolysis?
Neil, I got to talk to you, Neil. It's heating in the absence of oxygen. What you're actually burning is fuel. You're burning the heat, whatever the heat source is. It could be electric heating. Doesn't necessarily have to be done with fossil fuels. But the idea is that you have a closed vessel and you heat it in the absence of oxygen. And if that ingredients in there aren't, which is probably part of the trash wheel problem, is all mixed together, and it's going to have fly ash and bottom ash, but it's inside this vessel. So what I've been told by people that do this stuff, you know, grassroots level, in a grassroots level symposium I was in Montana, told me that he collected plastics. People brought him the plastics. He put it in a machine in his junkyard and heated it up in the absence of oxygen. And then he poured off the oil. And he said he was having people climbing out of the woodwork with tanker trucks to come and get this because it was low sulfur crude. That's what the refineries wanted. So that's what I know about it.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on incineration, but from my reading, the exhaust, the emissions from a pyrolysis plant are almost identical to garbage burning.
Well, then it's not like this guy that was doing it in the grassroots that I talked to, because it would have to be heated in the absence of oxygen, so it couldn't release these vapors. So I don't know. I mean, I guess probably what happens is it's sort of like when they spill the nurdles on the train tracks. You know, they're really careful trying to get it where they from point A to point B, but there's always this connect and disconnect problem. And I think probably when you disconnect or, you know, somehow get the petroleum out of that thing, you're probably got a lot of volatile gases that are escaping, and probably those are highly toxic. So I think, and the bottom line is probably you're right that it is a form of burning, but it's a form of vaporization, I guess you'd say, because it's not necessarily, you know, consumed by the fire.
I understand, and I cannot carry the conversation on further because it's just not my field. I don't know if anyone else is here, or perhaps we should invite someone, perhaps Mike Ewall or Paul Connett, to focus on the pros and cons of pyrolysis.
Well, I think Paul Connett would be a really good addition to this discussion, because having now edited Paul and his interview for the Recycling Archives, I can tell you that he has the clearest, most concise description of why burning plastics creates dioxins and dibenzofurans that I've ever seen anywhere. He starts with the atomic structure of things and then moves out from there. And it's
I traveled Italy with Paul, and I heard him speak many times.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true that the largest source of dioxins is the burning of trash.
Yeah.
It's incontrovertible.
Let me climb back in here then.
What you need to ask Paul is, what are the downsides of the gases that are produced in addition to the low sulfur crude oil that's produced in a pyrolysis plant? Because these are what these guys are pushing for. Don't get me wrong, I don't want this stuff, but these guys are pushing for it because it's their last chance. They want to continue to produce the junk that we can't recycle, and then force us to do phony non-recycling as a last resort. I'm sick and tired of it.
So Charles, let me jump back in here. I think that it would be good to have a future show talking about pyrolysis and getting people who are more chemistry minded than at least I am to talk about it. And it's certainly a problem that even if you try to collect this stuff, you got to sort it and do something with it. That costs money, it costs time, it costs resources. So going back to, you know, trying to do something that people feel good about. And you see the videos of the trash wheel and these boats out there in the water scooping up stuff. As a collection method, is it better to invest? Do you think, Charles, do you think it's better to invest in something like that? Or is it better to invest in these programs that are trying to screen the rivers that flow into the ocean? Is there one better than the other to invest in?
You must understand a concept that we have in the field. It's called last chance capture. The ocean is not, you've already had your last chance if it's in the ocean. last chance capture occurs before your rivers reach the sea. Any method that facilitates last chance capture is going to be far and above any method that tries to scoop it up out of the open ocean. I mean, the mixing process is very rapid, and the depth of the ocean on average is 2 miles. And I've found bottles in the ghost nets that I've picked up that have been so deep in the ocean that the fine monofilament gill netting that was stuck in this bottle was pressurized so tight and squished so tight it didn't break the bottle. But when it came back up to the surface and you held it upside down, I had it in my lab for a long time. No water, there was seawater in the bottle, you could see it, but that monofilament line with individual strands of line in a gill net were compressed so tight together that the water did not leak out at all from that bottle. And so you're not going to make any, it's buoyant slat is a publicity stunt in the ocean. But when he brings his fancy, looks like, Star Wars space outfit to Ballona Creek, which is draining the center of Los Angeles into an area that we've sampled and found more plastic than plankton. That's not a bad thing. I'm okay with buoyant slat doing that. I just think is getting a bunch of money together so he can hire diesel-powered tugboats to go out in the ocean and do a futile attempt to corral some of the trash that's, thousands and thousands and thousands of square kilometers in extent. I did a calculation in my book, Plastic Ocean. If they looked at all the 5 gyres and had a vessel the size of the one Boyan's got out there now, just to do the cleanup without any new stuff going in, it would be 70,000 years.
So if you don't like to have plastic in our waterways, and investing in a last chance capture system is maybe not cost effective, what's the best you can advocate for getting plastic out of our waterways in 2020?
Economic and political revolution. Would you like me to read my piece that there's a scientist network for a binding environmental treaty that they're trying to get us scientists involved in. And now the United States is trying to break off and have its own plastics treaty. So I'm just disgusted with it. And so I wrote, I was asked by an Italian journalist to respond if I was going to join in this scientist network for environmental treaty against plastic pollution. And this was my response. Can I read it?
Is it short? Otherwise, I'd ask you to maybe put it in the chat or email it to us.
No, you got to have my emphasis. This is, I'm talking to you guys.
Okay, go ahead.
It says, all I can offer is this quote, as I will not be participating in SNEP or its counterpart. Here's what I said. At the grassroots, we know that the plastic plague is overtaking the biosphere and a global plastic pandemic is inevitable. Synthetic polymers are a pollutant which, beyond the shadow of a doubt, continue to grow and have become so small and ubiquitous that they will not go away in a time frame equal to the entire history of civilization. No government will attack the profitable hyperconsumption paradigm fueled by the pivot from petroleum as fuel to petroleum as plastic, which is the solid form of petroleum. Therefore, a true reckoning with the plastic plague at the international government level is an exercise in futility and will waste much valuable time working at the grassroots to create plastic-free circularity.
Well, I would imagine, Charles, that you don't want to spend the rest of your life doing something that's futile. Most of us don't like to do things as futile. So what do you?
I've been involved in a futile attempt to stop the plastic plague since its inception. I've been over 28 years.
So what are you going to do?
It's gotten nothing but worse. Nothing but worse. It's like climate change. Yeah, okay, we want to reduce our carbon footprint, but it keeps growing every year. So I guess it's not working.
So what are you going to do for the next 28 years?
One direction, insurrection, one solution, revolution. What can I say? I'm a child of the 60s.
I'm just finishing up an essay on Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And people don't know it, but Engels was the first industrial ecologist. And my conclusion is that if they were alive today, they'd tell you to join a revolutionary organization and compost, because they understood you had to put nutrition back. To pick up on what Charlie said, I can't agree more. The solution is to ban the toxic stuff that's in these plastic products, and then to tax plastic. What you don't like, you tax. You tax hybrid packaging and so forth. But in order for this to happen, there's only one way, and that is community organizing. You've got to get out there and talk to people. You have to influence people, because government won't change unless there's a mass movement.
Okay. Well, I was intending to hold questions.
I'll finish in a second. We're going off the cliff. This is the time for mass movements.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, before we end, I don't know how our time is going, but I'd like to tell you about the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research and our acquisition of a building now that we'd like you all to help with design and use of recycled materials in this new microplastics laboratory space.
I'll ask you about that, but I want to come back to one thing first, which is you're in Southern California. You're living communities that are badly impacted by plastic litter, and local governments theoretically are easier to influence than, say, the U.S. Senate. Have you had any interest in local governments in your community buying in to want to do something to tax plastic or ban plastic or any of those kinds of things?
Well, we've had totally ineffective bans. COVID just totally destroyed the concept of, plastic bag bans and similar throwaways. But in terms of nuisance, that's what Neil and I have been working on at the Albatross Coalition with Lori Mendez, who's an attorney, to find municipalities that, we're not getting it done with the bans. They're seeping out throughout every little orifice. So what we need is a nuisance, abatement, demand that this plastic is a nuisance, not only to our aesthetic sensibilities, but to our health. And we can demonstrate multiple ways that it's there and it's causing a negative impact. We just need the law to demand that it be taken as a nuisance and abated.
But surely these cities are spending a lot of money on, litter abatement that they by rights ought to be able to pass on to the people that have caused the litter. Are you having any luck influencing them to do that?
I'm not an influencer. I try not to try to piss off the influencers.
Well, I can't say that Lori Mendez, a lawyer from California, who's part of our Save the Albatross committee, I guess, coalition, she is ready and willing, and we are actively recruiting cities to file these lawsuits to do exactly what you say, John. That is, when the Sierra Club or a green group goes out and cleans up a bay, that's 100 people for a whole day. Those people need to get paid, and it has to be an ongoing thing. And we want to tax the industry or file lawsuits against the industry. So all of that is in the works. We, of course, can't predict anything. But Lori, perhaps we could have Lori on for one of these sessions. She's quite articulate about the law and what can be done and what can't be done at the local level.
Okay. So Charles, I'm going to ask you about the More Research Foundation, and I'm going to open it up to the group for questions.
Yeah, we found that education was important, research was important, but as the stuff got smaller and smaller and harder to analyze, we realized we were going to have to up our game in the research department. We're still amplifying our educational outreach, but to do the research and the nano scale, we need expensive instruments. So we found an investor that was willing to provide these instruments, actually to lease them to us at no cost. And so we took off as the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research, its own 501c3, but is joined at the hip with Algalita Marine Research and Education, work out of the same office. And it's getting really cramped. I turned a nail salon into our lab, and we have many measures to keep plastic out as we do our analysis with our FTIR. But the space is cramped, and we have a BYO store, a bring your own store, with all the refills on half of our office. So that's a storefront facing where people come and bring their glass bottles and refill their shampoo and stuff. And then we've got our office right behind that in a very small footprint. Now, a hair therapy salon that had a lot of individual treatment rooms went bust, and it's just been hanging around for lease, and it's right next door to us. And it needs a lot of work, and it needs a lot of brilliant architectural thinking, but it's going to be, I've gotten an investor to say they're going to pay for our rent. So we want to take and make this into a showcase for microplastic research. What we do, there's a 4-year program with the Water Board now to make all the treatment plants have to figure out how much plastic they got, and we're the guys that do the data entry for that system. And we're going to be the first accredited lab to have certification in microplastics analysis in drinking water. So that's going to really expand their need for the tap traps, which is a device we invented that you just screw onto your tap that has a flow meter and a 5-micron screen, and you can put as much tap water as you can get it through that filter in there, and then analyze the filter coming off on a mechanical stage that will go at a high power microscope and see all those plastic fibers, and then take them over to the FTIR and find out what kind of plastic they are. So we're poised to have a lot of work in that field, and we're going to be the pioneers in determining how much plastic is in our drinking water, and I might say pushing the physiologists among us to find out what the health effects is of that, because we know they can't be good. Plastic is an insulator. The brain is an active electrical organ. If we're going to, and we've seen this stuff pass the blood-brain barrier, so if we're clogging up our brains with plastic as an insulator, it's not going to be good for our scores intellectually. So that's what we're doing. So I just encourage you guys, if you want to come help us figure out how to do it, or you want to see the floor plan, or you want to see the space that's right on the ocean. It's at the mouth of the San Gabriel River, a huge pollution hotspot where we cut our teeth working in that beach and doing those studies. So this is going to be a focus of the east side of Long Beach. We got the aquarium, the Aquarium of the Pacific on the west side. Now we're going to have the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research and Algalita Marine Research here on our south side. So yeah, please, I'd be just excited to announce it because I just got the key yesterday. We get 2 months of free rent, and it's a lot of plumbing. A lot of thing got torn out of that hair salon, and we got a lot of figuring out to do and a lot of work to do. But I'm going to fundraise for it, and I hope we're successful.
Well, congratulations on getting the funding and moving that forward. It sounds like an interesting project. I'm wondering, let's say you create this testing and certification system, and let's assume that you're right, that our tap water is littered with microplastics. What do you expect the regulators to do with your data?
Same thing they did with the washing machine fibers. put in filters. You know, there's aggregation devices. Everybody's trying to do cleanup. Nobody's trying to do prevention. It's the same old song. But, you know, there's a million different prevention schemes out there, and they'll try them all.
Well, Charles, thank you for joining us tonight. It's always great to, you know, to talk to a real pioneer who really brought something important to everybody's consciousness. I really appreciate that you're doing that. I want to give other people a chance to ask you questions if they want to before we stop. Dan? Yeah,
I'd like to just bring up the whole issue of banning and put in a word for it. I know, Charles, you said you think that that's inadequate, and I don't think anything's the true solution, but I do want to make an observation. I was around when Berkeley became one of the very first cities to ban styrofoam. Everybody was really pissed at styrofoam. They didn't like it at all. It was all over the place. It was in the gutters. It was blowing around because it's real light, and you step on it and it turns into a whole bunch of little things that are like popcorn, and just a total nuisance, as you say. So they banned it and said, you can't, coffee shops, you know, coffee all of a sudden is a big thing. So everybody's getting their coffee in styrofoam because it doesn't burn your fingers, you know, it's a good insulator and all that good stuff. But the ban, within weeks, months, certainly, you had product substitution. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind. Banning leads to product substitution. And the products that are substituted for the products that you don't want turn out to be better because they're more recyclable. Another example is Berkeley now with Ecology Center in the lead, but a lot of other people very fed up with the amount of plastic pollution coming out of restaurants. So Berkeley's got over 600 restaurants. Well, over a period of time, with a lot of information, Berkeley came to the conclusion that they had to ban plastics and what they call disposables, starting with things like straws, but other things too, that are made out of plastic. And what happened right after that ban went into effect, and it's still going on now, and it's spreading all over, is that we get new businesses that have just sprung up. And what they're doing is they're bringing in metal foodware and washable foodware. And they actually have a service where they go and pick up all the dirty stuff, go and sanitize it and bring it back. And, you know, they're making it work as a business proposition. So here again, you see banning followed by product substitution.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. It's war on all fronts. You know, I'm in favor of all this stuff. I only said that, you know, there's a lot of blow by, you know.
Yeah, I understand. All I wanted to do is get that concept across. Banning
I'm all for it. More bans, the better. The more bans, the better.
Bonnie, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Charles, for your talk today. It was really enjoyable. So I'm with an organization called Zero Waste Youth. And I just want to get your opinion. What should youth have in their toolbox when it comes to advocating for zero waste?
I think one of the most important things in your toolbox is your youth itself. The fact that you are young means that you're an influencer. You're an influencer in the sense that it's impossible to ignore you in a forum of a bunch of old people, because you bring to them the issues that they need to deal with in order to be successful as politicians. So in your toolbox, I think what you need is a real solid plan on how to organize for youthful presentations at local government forums. to deal with the various pollutions, and not only pollution as, the need for recycling, but pollution as poison, how it's affecting your lives physiologically, not only emotionally, but physiologically, trash is affecting you. The more you learn about plastic trash, the more you'll understand just how serious those threats are to your physiology. And I think that emotional appeal to the political status quo is highly effective.
Yep, that is great to think about and consider as we're planning our 10th annual convergence. So aiding youth with these tools and these ideas so that they can go back to their communities and advocate for zero waste. So perhaps having workshops around community organizing and ways to engage our municipal leaders.
Yeah, please give my best regards. I enjoyed the Zero Waste Youth Conference in Portugal. It was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Just the best Portuguese experience you could ever imagine. And then getting to go to the beach and seeing all the stuff happening, it was just amazing. The Zero Waste Youth are just such dynamite organizers. So keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Charles?
Charles, how old are you?
I'm 3/4 of a century.
75?
Yeah.
Wow. I'm 82, Charles.
Yeah, so I'm glad, because 80 is the new 60, and yeah, that's good. That's
well,
good.
You'll be surprised when you get to be 80. It changes you quite a bit.
Oh, please don't talk to me about changes due to aging. As if I don't know anything about it.
Well, when you're young, you think you're immortal, and then you start to realize when you get a few scrapes and some painful things happen to you that you're not. And it gets more frequent, and all of a sudden you see all your friends, like my good friend Mark Arill, dying. And I thought we'd be able to be talking still, but 10 years ago he died. So you have to then
life is short and death is a common occurrence, but your life can be as heavy as Mount Tai or as light as a feather. To die for the polluters is lighter than a feather, but to die for the recyclers is heavier than Mount Tai.
And you got to use the life you've got. So with that, we'll adjourn for this evening. Every second Tuesday, we present the ZWAC show. We have a feature from the Recycling Archives. We interview an interesting speaker. Please join us in December for that. We'll have another good show. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, everybody.